Hello, everyone, and welcome to a special webinar today. Appreciate you all dialing in, no doubt from many corners of the world, although I think the vast majority of our registrations today are from those of you based in North America. So thank you so much for joining us. My name is Blake Hutchison. I am the CEO here at Flippa, the number one platform globally to buy and sell online businesses. And I'm joined for this special webinar today, How Smart Business Formation Leads to Better Exits, by the founder and CEO of Tailor Brands, Yali Saar. Yali, how are you today? Yali will join me shortly. There he is.
Blake, great to be here.
Hey,
Thank you
Yali,
so
how you
much for
doing?
having me.
So we've got over 300 plus people joining us today, and it's going to be a good session running for approximately 45 minutes. So please do stick around. The information will be hopefully extraordinarily helpful for both new startup founders alike, as well as those who are more established. What we're talking about is how smart business formation can lead to better exits. We're going to talk a little bit from Yali's perspective about proper formation and making those early decisions in the beginning of your business to ensure that your business is best set up to grow. And of course, the downstream impact of that is that you're better set up for an exit. So we'll do a quick introduction to each of Yali and myself, including the businesses that we run and how they can respectively help you get what you're trying to do, or help you achieve what you're trying to achieve. We'll talk a little bit about the business life cycle, the stages of business, and how that ultimately ends up in that exit discussion. We'll talk about formation and growth more specifically, scaling and preparing for exit. Key insights, so building a sustainable and sellable business. And in that context, we'll actually give some examples of deals that have been done, the multiples that they've been done at, the buyers that have been involved, and how those buyers think about those types of deals. So that's going to be a really, really practical information sharing session. And then, of course, we'll hand over to you, address all of the questions that come up. Now, if you do have questions at any time, my understanding is you can just drop those into the questions or comments box. And of course, Yali and I will get to those throughout the course of the discussion.
Nice to be here, and thank you for having me.
A big welcome to you again. Thank you so much for joining. It's really great to be in partnership with Tailor Brands. Why don't we just start with a very high-level introduction, Yali? We've obviously got 300 plus people registered today. Some people will be a part of the Flippa community already. Some people are part of the Tailor Brands community. Maybe just for the sake of those people mostly new to Tailor Brands, give us a quick introduction to the business.
Yeah, sure. So, Tailor Brands is one of the largest business incorporators in the US. We're responsible for roughly 2% of all new businesses created in America. Tailor Brands really helps first-time business owners form their business, stay compliant, and grow with confidence. Our platform today offers kind of the main package, allows people to register a company in the US, receive full management services that handle anything from annual filing, the licenses that you need for the business, and kind of everything that arrives from either authorities or, God forbid, lawsuits. And today, I think, despite the fact that, business compliance makes up 90% of our business, it's only kind of a 3-year old part of our kind of business journey. Our mission was always to simplify business creation for first-time business owners. Started way back in the day as a logo maker, and realized that the first thing that makes you official and helps you pitch your idea to people might be the logo, but you really need a whole range of services to make sure that you're set up for success. So we kind of took our own kind of path from starting a business and making all the wrong decisions when we started it, all the way to where we're at today with a full platform, over 24 different services, and really servicing a vast majority of U.S. business formations.
Yali, just quickly, I think you're the third largest business incorporator in the US. Is that correct?
Yeah, that is correct. At least based on what I'm told. So we deal with literally hundreds of thousands of new businesses every year, and it's our mission to help people not just launch their business and take care of all of the paperwork that they don't want to deal with, but also make sure that everything is set up in a way that would help them achieve all of their goals throughout kind of the business life cycle, whether it's conducting business properly or setting them up to a place where when they're ready to take that next step, whether it's selling the business or anything else. The business is really set up in the most appropriate way to do that.
So let's just maybe give everyone a little bit of context as to that checklist when you're first starting out a business. I mean, you mentioned that you started out as a logo maker, and you alluded to the fact that in many cases that might be people's first thought when they have an idea or initiate a business concept. I also, in the past, I worked at Xero, which was a cloud accounting software provider. And I obviously come from this view that understanding your books very early on is one of the most important parts of starting a business and forming it in the right way. Given the business that you run, what is that checklist? What are the things that a founder should have as they kick off a business?
Yeah, so I think, really maybe when you're just starting out with an idea, one of the first things that you need to help you make it look official so you can start kind of testing your idea is really kind of, let's say, the visual components of it, right? Maybe a logo and a domain might be everything that you need to actually just run the idea. But I think once you're ready to go from ideation phase to actually launching a business, I think, a few of the kind of essential things, and again, this is not a legal advice, this is more kind of based on cautionary tales that we've seen in the past, making sure that you separate your personal assets from your business assets and creating that checklist that, for some might include, setting up an LLC and an EIN and making sure that you have a proper registered agent in place and making sure really that if anything bad happens, then it all stays encapsulated in that business entity are a few of the most important things that we see today in kind of making that jump from an idea to an actual business. And what we do on the platform today is that when somebody has an idea for a business and he's kind of ready to take that next step, he goes onto tailorbrands.com. We ask a series of questions, and based on these questions, we kind of figure out what are the right next milestones for that specific idea. So it might end up being, a domain and a logo, which we provide on the platform. It might be that you're ready to take that next step and do an LLC and an EIN and a registered agent and really kind of turn it into an official business. You might need specific permits to actually kind of run your business. And these are the things that the system kind of looks out for. So we want to make sure that you don't start conducting business and then 2 months afterwards, 3 months after, 4 months afterwards, you get a heavy fine that makes you take a detour that you didn't want to take so early on in the business life cycle.
Yeah, and I guarantee you that there's someone listening in with a more established business right now that wishes that they had gone through a basic level checklist of separating personal expenses from business expenses and that type of asset demarcation, because we see almost daily here at Flippa exits fall over as a function of those very early formation days, maybe not being as well thought out as possible. And what are you seeing out there right now, Yali? You're obviously fast growing. Flippa's in a very similar phase of business. It's a very exciting time for business owners generally. It's a very exciting time for entrepreneurs generally, more business types across more platforms. One of the things that I've always found interesting is that the average exit on Flippa is a 6.5-year-old business. And what's really interesting about that is the platforms that they're actually initiating these businesses being part of that creation stage, like a Shopify or Amazon FBA or even WordPress for a content site, YouTube channels, these types of assets. I mean, those platforms alone are only a decade to 2 decades old. So it's still very early days in this kind of at least digital entrepreneurship landscape. What are some of the things that you're seeing occur on the platform? Do you register the type of business that someone is starting? What are some of the things that are going on out there?
So we're seeing two kind of main trends, I think, that are kind of rising lately. The first one is that we're seeing more and more people that are actually starting their business. So if, let's say, a couple of years back, you needed a whole team or at least a couple of partners to really start your business, I think that the type of AI tools that are available today, the idea that you can actually go all the way from ideation to an MVP, and really kind of set up the entire business using different types of bots allows more people to actually set up their business alone. That's definitely one kind of course that we're seeing on the platform. The other one, which I think kind of originates from a similar, in a way, from a similar evolution, from a kind of giving a little bit of a different effect, is the reason people are starting businesses. So I think that, up until, let's say, again, 2, 3 years ago, the majority of people coming to the platform were still people that are starting a business out of a passion or a certain idea. And what we are seeing more and more is that people are looking at starting a business as more kind of as a form of insurance, really, for their income stream. So these could be people that have either been already laid off due to AI or are starting to rethink their future in kind of their 9 to 5 corporate job. And they understand that they need diversification. Diversification isn't just about investments, it's also about the income streams that you have. So we're seeing a lot more people that are starting what we used to refer to as a side business, right? But today, with the type of automations that anyone has in their fingertips, they can actually really run a full scale business in parallel to their 9 to 5 job.
Yeah. I mean, obviously, we come at it from a slightly different lens, but it's the same philosophy in the sense that a lot of the people coming onto the platform to buy a business similarly are looking at it from a similar standpoint. It is an insurance policy. It's supplementary income. It's on top of what they might do day to day as an insurance policy. And of course, in many cases, people are buying their next job. So instead of going for another job or starting a business, they're acquiring their next job. And we've sort of come up with this, I guess, triangular view of how you think about buying a business, which is passion. So look at things which are in an area that you're passionate about. Skills. Don't buy something you're passionate about, but where you don't have the skills to apply. And then opportunity. Look at a business and an asset that is run well today, but still has opportunity for meaningful upside. So I guess similar in that regard. And so then let's just summarize this before we move into this, I guess, more deep dive into the Tailor Brands perspective around formation and growth. Why do you think it's so important to have, I guess, one, concept of an exit strategy from day one, and maybe that is about better setup, but also how you can influence growth by formulating a business the right way to begin with?
Yeah, so I think, I mentioned a little earlier before, right, that we made a couple of mistakes early on in our life cycle. And, if I have to encapsulate all of these mistakes into kind of one thesis, it's really around the fact that, what separates first-time founders from second-time founders is the ability to have kind of a set plan to what they're trying to achieve with either building a business or, in your case, really kind of buying a business, right? But first-time founders often jump into business building, while what we see is that serial founders often kind of reverse engineer the entire process. So when people start a business, they need to first figure out, first and foremost, are you building something to give you job security? That's a solid reason in our day and age. Are you building something that you want to pass on to next generations? Are you building something to sell, right? And whatever you decide that is your goal, you can start working backwards to figuring out really the best way to set you up for success in that specific path, right? It might not be easy. It might not work exactly like you initially planned, and you might have, set up a course and it deviates from time to time. But if there isn't a plan, then everything is really down to luck. The thesis that we have is really kind of how do you reverse engineer your business building? And the first step before, you go to Flippa, before you go to Tailor Brands, is setting up the why, meaning what is your actual goal for setting up the business. And we really, we have kind of a set framework for how to work backwards from there.
And do you think that when people are establishing that goal, it's a financial goal mostly, Yali?
It's a good question. I think that oftentimes you tell yourself that the goal isn't financial, but I think what separates a business from a hobby is also understanding what is the actual kind of, you call it financial, I call it a business goal, right? What is the checkmate? And maybe to your point, you're building something that, you just want to have the title of a CEO. Okay, that's great. How do you build a business in a way that allows you to continue operating it with the least amount of time that you have to kind of invest into business building? And I think understanding the financial checkmate. And sometimes the financial checkmate is, I don't want to make any money out of it. I don't know a lot of business owners, by the way. That's their kind of set goal for building a business. But understanding how do you define success for a business is really important.
I think that this is a really critical piece that most people misunderstand, actually, because everyone has a goal of creating a good quality, sustainable business. Some people have a goal of creating a very large business. And often people forget, with the exception of the VC backed businesses that are able to raise capital, drive some kind of very accelerated growth and achieve unicorn status or achieve rare air. I think it's important for us to break down how few businesses actually can achieve that size and why it's actually very viable to own a good quality small business that is set up well from the beginning for a long time. So I'll just give people some context here. In the US, there's 30 plus million, so 33 to 35 million businesses that are registered. And as you know, Yali's business, Tailor Brands, is the third largest originator of business formation in the US. The revenue cohorts are really interesting. 65% of businesses within that, so 22.5 million businesses are doing sub $50,000 in revenue. So this is like side hustles, freelancers, brand new startups. It's really important for people to understand the scale of the businesses that are truly micro in nature. 7.5 million, so like 22% of businesses between 50 and 250,000. 4% between 250,000 and $1 million in turnover. So that's 1.4 million businesses. Then between 1 and 10 mil, 8%. So that's 2.8 million businesses. What most people don't understand is that sub 1% of businesses turn over more than $10 million. And so because we spend all this time reading about how great these big businesses are, we tend to think that that's the land of the many when it truly is the land of the few.
And I'll add to that, if I may, right? I think one of the most confusing definitions in the US is small businesses. We talk about small business owners. The truth is, 99.9% of businesses in the US fall under the category of a small business. So I think the current figure is anything under 300 employees can be considered, there's also a turnover, but anything over 300 employees can be considered a small business. And when you look at, the percentages of people that stay at a business of one, that's over 80% of businesses. I would argue that, it doesn't matter if you're building a small business, a micro business, or even if you're one of those, top 1% that are kind of more in our field of, venture-backed businesses with large turnover. You have to be able to figure out what success means to you if you want to build it the right way. You have to be able to figure out, assuming that, you want to sell your business, what are the KPIs that would make that specific business appealing to a buyer? How do you connect that? How do you connect yourself to a likely buyer? Once you have those two figured out, you can start kind of drawing your starting point and start building the steps to take you from point A to B and so forth. And I think running that process is invaluable, whether you're building a business that is turning $150 million a year. It's also invaluable if you're building a business that the entire kind of goal is turning over $50,000 or $100,000. If the goal is selling your business in 3 years and you have to be debt free when you get there, then you might change how you plan funding. Or if you know that you need to be one of the top 3 local brands in your space that, for somebody to be interested in looking at your business, and that might change your entire GTM strategy. And life will happen throughout the way. The path won't unfold accordingly exactly to your initial plan. But as long as you have that goal in place, in my view, you'll be fine because you can always ask yourself the same 3 questions. Is my goal still right? Are the steps that I'm taking though are still the right steps? And how do I get back on track from that specific point? So I think before, get into what we see in terms of right steps information, you need to figure out, the purpose and figure out the baby steps to take you to that purpose.
So 2 specific questions. You've pointed out that, people need to establish goals and they need to have a very clear view of where they're going. And of course, the path is likely to not be linear, as you and I probably both full well know. Two specific questions for you. How does separating personal and business assets protect founders throughout the business lifecycle?
Yeah. So setting up your business correctly from the start, including choosing the right legal structure like an LLC is critical when it comes to exiting your business. And this goes back to the point about reverse engineering the business plan that I talked about. So, and again, this isn't legal advice, but I would recommend anyone that is building something to create a business entity around it first and foremost for protection. If X hits the fan, and you have an LLC in place and a proper registered agent and an EIN and a separate bank account, you essentially created kind of a corporate veil that protects your personal asset. But in an exit scenario, this becomes even more interesting because let's say that you're developing a software or even launching a vending machine business with a partner. If you haven't built the business into a company and the assets aren't listed on that company, and I've had friends that have found themselves in that place that they had a partner that they trust, 100%, but, path doesn't unfold exactly how you planned. And in 4 or 5 years from now, that partner might not be your best friend. And you find yourself debating what you can actually sell and who owns what later down the roads if the assets aren't listed on a company. LLCs are usually easier to transfer in an exit scenario, but that is mostly true if you don't, plan on selling just a portion of your business, which might actually work better if you set up a corporation, right? So if you actually kind of reverse engineer what your plan is, if you say, I'm never going to sell 100% of the business in my view today, but I might want to bring in somebody to take some liquidity of the business later down the road, then setting up a corporation might be the right kind of path. This type of guidance is really what you get on our platform. So of course, you kind of form LLC through Tailor, and the idea is not just to tell you this is what you need for an LLC. The idea is also to figure out if you actually need an LLC, you need something else, and how should you actually structure the business to kind of get you in the right path to where you want to be. And the truth is, even for us, we can't help guide you if you don't know where you're actually planning to go.
And so if someone's looking to start two businesses, maybe they're running, I guess, a parallel track, they set up two separate LLCs. What is the general approach to multi-asset formation?
So I'll ask you this. Are you planning to, are those two really separate businesses? Are you looking at those as, a holding company that you might want to sell the entire business as one? So again, this goes back to the goal setting. If you're saying, I'm building two businesses and one of them might work well and the other might not, and you don't want those two things to be mixed, then, my recommendation there would probably be set up two separate complete entities, right? But if you're looking to kind of create a powerhouse that creates more and more businesses under one umbrella, that's a whole different story, right? So understanding how do you envision the next 2, 3, 4 years is critical. And I will say this, it is possible to change paths throughout the way, right? But if you don't have any type of entity going into this, it might be harder, A. And as you probably know, you have your experience with Zero, etc. Once the business starts turning revenue, all of those structuring things become a whole lot more complicated because there's basically tax implications for anything that you do.
So this actually happens here a lot, Yali, at Flippa. So we'll get someone who chooses to exit, or at least they attempt to exit, and they list the assets on the Flippa platform, and they get a lot of interest. And ultimately, they finally arrive at an LOI. So that's a letter of intent, and that's been submitted by a buyer. The buyer will then go into due diligence, and it will be an absolute mess. So you'll have not only an LLC, which essentially has not competing businesses within it, but businesses with different interest sets within it. And so trying to actually establish which assets belong to which business, albeit the same LLC, And then you even have financials mixed up. So you'll have an AWS, a hosting bill, for instance, as an example, which covers two completely different assets. The buyer only wants one of those assets. They're completely different. They're different industries, different business models, different customer sets. And it's almost impossible to distinguish between the two. So
Yeah, and at that point, it's even hard to do a carve out because you're not even sure what you're actually carving out of which business, right?
yeah, it's so messy that the deal falls over because you can't actually distinguish the revenue base. The revenue base is actually easier. It's the cost base which gets really messy.
Yeah, I think that, we again, I think one of the one of the curses of doing any type of business for the first time is that you're convinced about the fact that you'll hit the road and you'll figure out things when you actually need to. But like anything, as things grow, if things grow, and I think we're all building businesses with the intent of seeing them succeed, right? So basically figuring out all those things once you succeed um, is, becomes a whole lot messier and tricky. And I would always recommend that people kind of plan for the best case scenario. And, worst case, it's always easier, even to dissolve a business if nothing happened, but it's much harder to actually set up a business once everything is already kind of running and the business is actually turning around.
All right. So what we're going to do is talk a little bit about the process of selling a business. And I'm going to talk here, and Yali's going to sort of feed in as he thinks about some of the formation specific questions that might come up as part of the exit process. And so one of the things that we often talk about here at Flippa, for obvious reasons, what drives a business valuation? And of course, Yali's entire business and Tailor Brands is set up to ensure that some of these things actually never occur in the first place, but it's important still to point them out. And so very, very, very basically, what a buyer will pay for when they look to acquire a business like the one that you might be building right now is revenue growth and predictability. And so what do we mean by that? We're not talking about unicorns. We're not talking about fast growth businesses here. We're talking about, remember, the 99%. We're talking about all of those businesses that are sub $10 million in turnover. It's not to say that you can't exit businesses which are greater than $10 million in turnover. Of course you can. But for the vast majority of the economy, we are talking about sub $10 million turnover businesses. And so revenue growth doesn't actually need to be stratospheric in nature, but growth, generally speaking, is something that buyers will pay a premium for. They will also pay a premium for predictability. So sometimes we meet founders who say, my business is actually really great, but it's extraordinarily seasonal. I do an amazing amount of trade in 3 months of the year and then almost nothing for the remainder of the other 9 months of the year. That uncertainty for a buyer is a little bit spooky. And so a business which is predictable, consistently performing is something that buyers will obviously pay for and pay a premium for. Yali and I have touched on this just a little bit. And Yali, please do jump in here, but clean books and organized financials. It's so critical. We talked about the messy situation of personal expenses and business expenses. And we also talked about the situation where there was multiple assets intermingled into one asset type or even in your accounting. That becomes really, really tricky. So,
And Blake, I might add to that. You're touching legal and compliance issues and avoidance, but I think it's exactly the same, right? In the other side of things. So you can have a clean and organized financial and also clean and organized compliance, right? I think that at the end of the day, when you go through that DD list, right, when the buyer finishes the LOI and you actually go into the deep DD, right, the disclosure schedule, or just the DD itself, you really have kind of the business questions. That's one angle of it, and the financial questions, another angle of it. That's great. There are so many things, right, that you want to make sure that the compliance is set up right, that you have the right permits to actually conduct the business that you're conducting in the right states that you're conducting it in, that you know who your clients are, that they are signing the right agreements with you to make sure that no one questions those revenue streams that you have when they're actually coming to buy the business. And I think those are things that a lot of the times people kind of end up tending to too late in the process, and eventually, they lose a premium for it.
Yeah. If you are not using cloud accounting software right now, I highly encourage you to do so. There's lots of different providers of that. Similarly, if you do have outstanding issues with tax compliance, highly encourage you to fix those things up. If you currently have any legal issues at all, fix those up well before you think about an exit process. It will just make it so much easier. And then, of course, if any of those issues have occurred in the past, disclose those up front because deals will fall over. Buyers are not dummies. They're not going to put quarter of a million, half a million, $1 million and more to work if they don't, without doing a great deal of due diligence. So just expect that will come. Metrics that matter. I think this is a really interesting one, Yali. You no doubt running Tailor Brands have some view of what your North Star metric is, and you have some view of all the other metrics that matter that orientate to that North Star and get you where you're going. Similarly here at Flippa, where we're essentially a platform for trade and we're a marketplace. And so we're worried about supply, the amount of supply coming on. We're worried about the amount of demand. We're worried about the fill rate. We're worried about all of those different metrics that govern how a marketplace can compete and operate sustainably on behalf of its customer base. This is the same for a small business owner. And the number of people I meet who don't actually have a very good sense for the metrics that matter for their business model. So if you're an e-commerce founder and you're listening to Yali and I chat today and you don't know what your refund rate is, go and figure it out. If you don't know what your average order value is, go and figure it out. If you don't know what your customer repeat rate is, go and figure it out. If you don't know what your cost to land is, go and figure it out. Similar for SaaS, LTV to CAC, MRR, ARR, your churn rate. These types of things, very, very important. If you're an app developer, don't come into the exit process and talk about number of people who have downloaded your app. It's mostly irrelevant. Talk about daily active users. In other words, figure out what the metrics are that matter for your business model because buyers are very sophisticated. They're the things they're going to go through one by one to make an assessment as to whether your business is the right business to acquire. And this is all part of setting up reporting up front as well, Yali.
And Blake, if I might add to that, right? And you mentioned before, the fact that, and I fully agree, right? It's disclosing everything is super important. It's also very important not to make abrupt changes in just before you're going into one of those processes, because one of the things that is mostly sensitive in the majority of businesses that I know of are those unit economics once you start pushing things, right? So I've met business owners that have went into a process of selling the business and have thought to themselves, okay, so I'm going to drive growth very fast just before that happens, and that creates a whole set of mess with their unit economics. It creates question marks around whether they can actually a kind of sustain that growth into the future. But at the end of the day, you want to have kind of that predictability, at least in my view, at least a year back with your cohorts, so you can actually basically make this case that what the past basically shows is what the future is going to look like for that business.
Hey, this is a really wonderful point because most people think that a sales process is actually shorter than it really is. The reality is $1 million business. So you're talking about 7 figures here. You're asking a buyer to put 7 figures to work. Those business sales will take 3 to 9 months in length. Now, what is actually occurring there is buyers are watching for how your business performs through that sales process. It's that get to know you phase. And so if you inflate revenue just before you go through that exit process, to your point, Yali, you're actually going to get found out because it's probably pretty good for cash flow. And if you can keep it up, great. But through that exit process, it actually raises more concern and buyers will question the long-term viability of that revenue creation.
And I'll add to that maybe, there is seasonality not just in business creation. There's also a seasonality in when is kind of an optimal time to go into one of those processes. And you really need to ask yourself when you're going into that process, you're going into it end of year and you have those predictions for end of year. Can you actually hit those predictions that you're supplying? Because if you're going to miss those because you're going to think the deal is going to close a month earlier, etc., you're going to pay for that a lot more than having a few inflated numbers in your projections, and figuring out where is the predictable kind of corner in your business and getting into that process when you're actually ready to go into a journey rather than a sprint is super important.
So we've touched on this a little bit, so I'll just quickly summarize, early growth decisions that impact exit value. So separate business and personal finances. If you can, not always possible in some of the business models that we're alluding to today, but build recurring or at least diversified revenue. Think about other ways, channels that you can bring diversified revenue sources in, so as you de-risk the business from that single revenue source. Documenting SOP, so that's standard operating procedures. If there's a way that you order from a particular supplier, document that. If there's a way that you sell to your customers, document that. If there's a way that you fulfill to those customers, document that. All of that documentation will go a long way. And we alluded to this, tracking meaningful metrics from day one. So, Yali, let's talk about the world of buyers out there, because let's assume that we have now established an organization, we have separated personal finances and or assets from the business ones, and everything's formed well. We've been growing now for a couple of years. People often say, well, who are the buyers out there? I must apologize. The font size on this particular screen is very, very small for some silly reason, but there is a big universe of buyers out there. There's buyers who are looking to buy small, a sub six figure, so call it between $50,000 and up to $100,000. There's acquisition entrepreneurs, and that's typically $100,000 up to maybe $500,000. And now you find strategics and even PE coming downstream into the marketplace to acquire businesses that are just short of seven figures up to, say, $10 million in revenue, and they're using those businesses for strategic reasons. They're bolting them onto their existing asset pool. Sometimes that asset pool is more offline and they need some online capability. And sometimes it's about increasing revenue. So it's an accretive play, acquire the revenue, bolt it in and make the business that they're running today even bigger. So traditional PE approach there. Now, there is competition for good quality businesses, and there tends to be less good competition for less good quality businesses. And so quality is not size. Quality is all of the things that Yali and I have alluded to today so far. Quality is not size. Quality is about the way the business runs day to day, the way it's well set up to exit. And that's a really important point.
And Blake, maybe to your point earlier, you talked about the revenue size of businesses. So I remember, we took some of that data a few years back, and if you look at M&A transactions on a global scale, right, and it's your kind of bread and butter, so correct me if I'm completely off skew, right? But if you look from 2015 to 2022, roughly 58% of transactions were transactions of sub $20 million, right? And as you are actually going up that scale, right? If you're looking to sell a business for, up to 100 million, that's maybe 27% additional. If you're going a little bit up and up. So as you actually grow the business, you're actually going to have a diminishing pool of likely buyers, and the quality becomes more and more important. So if your goal, and again, going back to kind of the reverse engineering, but if your goal is to sell the business, sometimes the right approach is not to continue on scaling it, but rather just improving the existing revenue stream as it is and not touching the scale.
This is a really important point. So for a business sub seven figures on Flippa, you'll tend to see just in excess of 2,500 interested parties. Now, that doesn't mean LOIs. It doesn't mean drafted asset purchase agreements. That means people who come in, sign a non-disclosure agreement, and actually look at the details of that business. So just in excess of 2,000 interested parties. When you move above seven figure, it drops to literally hundreds instead of thousands. And that's very logical, isn't it? The number of people that you and I both know, Yali, who can afford to spend $1 million plus on an asset, given that most of them are majority cash down, even if there is seller financing or an earnout or a stability payment that governs some percentage of the asset or exit value. You're talking about a large amount of upfront cash or capital to be able to deploy into a seven-figure business. Even if you go get an SBA loan, for instance, you're still going to be subject to a credit check. They're going to go through your assets and understand your personal ability to service that loan. So there's just, to your point, far fewer buyers looking for bigger businesses. And so sometimes optimizing between 6 and low 7 figures is a great pathway to exit if that's the journey you want to take. So let's just have a look about let's just give people a bit of a reality check. Small business, and you just said before, sub 300 employees, which I suspect means both Tailor Brands and Flippa might be considered small. We've got 80 employees. I'm not sure how many you've got there, Yali. Sub 300 is still considered small. Anyway, for the purpose of this discussion, people need to understand that business valuations in small business land are not pegged to the public markets and they're not pegged to VC multiples. It's a different game. It's a subscale M&A game. And so we use market comparables, and the market comparables are built off the back of our marketplace. And so our marketplace is the largest trading platform on the planet for businesses sub $10 million turnover. And as a result of that, we see a lot of buyer interest. We get a sense for valuation, and those market comparables, what drive our valuations. And so what does that mean? Well, that means that if you come to us and you say, well, hang on, I saw Adobe pay X for SEMrush, and that was a multiple of Y in the low billions of dollars in exit value, that multiple is unlikely to be the same multiple you might get for your SaaS business, which is trading 7 figures or 8 figures in revenue. So it truly is a different landscape. So what we do is we look at SDE, that's seller discretionary earnings multiples. That's essentially revenue minus costs plus add backs. Those add backs are the things that are unlikely to be carry forward costs for the acquirer ongoing. For instance, if you've paid yourself an enormous salary, it's likely that they can likely hire a GM for less than what you're paying yourself a salary. If you've just paid a designer for a complete UI overhaul, that's unlikely to be a carry forward cost. Some of these things will be added back for the purposes of showing an adjusted net profit number, and that's commonly referred to as SDE. Revenue multiples will give you, and all of this is actually accessible at flippa.com market insights. So just go to flippa.com, click the insights button there. In fact, Tori will probably drop in the link for you all here if you're following along, and you can check out current marketplace multiples. Ultimately, buyers decide value, but you decide whether you want to exit or not. And so this is a really important point. If you list, you don't have to exit. But if you list, it's a buyer who will ultimately decide the value of your business. You get to set the price. Allow you to do that. Will allow you to do that within a reasonable range. And those reasonable ranges will be governed by market comparables. But then buyers will ultimately decide based on all of the optionality they have in the marketplace, whether your business is worth what you're asking. And so it's really, really important that people understand that there is a fundamental difference between the things you read about, which are typically bigger businesses, and the exit realities of sub $10 million turnover businesses.
And Blake, if I may, I think that, from my perspective at least, there are two additional things to consider here, and one of them is really competition. If you can drive competition for buying the business, that eventually creates a higher multiples. The other item is understanding that the financial landscape at the specific point in time where you decide to sell the business also has implication. That could be the case if a public company is buying you, and the multiples in the market will eventually also dictate a little bit about the multiples that they're willing to pay, or the interest rates that might affect how leveraged a PE can be when they're setting up kind of the acquisition of the business as well. So monitoring the financial landscape is also an important trait when you're thinking about selling the business.
All right. Well, what I'm going to do now is give people a real world example. And then I think, Yali, you and I are going to jump into the chat window if you can access that at your end, because we've got a bunch of questions and we'll riff along with some of those questions, or at least the themes around those questions. So while you're doing that, I'll just quickly give people a real world example of a deal that was recently completed, just so people can get a feel for what's actually going on in the marketplace. So the particular business I'll allude to happens to be a direct-to-consumer e-commerce business. It was in the baby and gifting space. And critically, one of the things that benefited this particular business was its age and its longevity as a good quality business. So it had been around for 11 years. 11 years in small business land you will get a premium for that. It shows that the business is scalable. Yes, it also shows that it's sustainable in the long run, and buyers love to see that. Young businesses, by the way, are hard to sell. I should point that out. Young businesses are hard to sell. Buyers are a little bit skeptical of their ability to continue throughout the lumpiness and growth stages of a business, downturns of a business, challenges, maybe geopolitical, higher interest rates, inflationary pressure, all these types of things. They want to see that a business has been able to ride those waves. So back to this case study, really importantly, I should point out up front that the business sold for about a 3 times profit multiple. Again, direct to consumer, e-commerce business, different for different business models. In this particular case, a 3 times profit multiple. So let me talk to you about the metrics a little bit. So the business was doing $7.5 million, $7.5 million in trailing 12-month revenue. And that was around 1.5 million in seller discretionary earnings. Just call that adjusted net profit for the sake of it. Now, what was really, really interesting about this particular business was that it was globally diversified. So they were doing 50% of their trade out of Australia, 45% of their trade out of the US and growing fast, and then another 5%, a relatively trivial amount that was geographically distributed around the world. Now, interestingly, what people loved about this particular business was the repeat rate of the purchasing behavior. So most e-commerce businesses are clearly not built for recurring purchase. That's not the nature of the business model. But some e-commerce businesses are able to build outstanding brand advocacy and loyalty among their community, and they're able to do that and then drive a fantastic repeat rate, which essentially assures their business growth a little bit better. Now, long story short, they had a 24% repeat purchase rate. 24% repeat purchase rate. So for every 100 customers who purchased last year, 24 of them will come back this year and purchase again. So buyers loved that. The other thing that buyers loved about this particular business were really two things. One, they'd only just started their performance marketing journey. They were getting a 5 times return on ad spend, but it wasn't the vast majority of their turnover. It wasn't attributed to the vast majority of their turnover. The vast majority of their turnover was actually word of mouth, the community itself celebrating the quality of the product that they were receiving as a function of buying from this particular brand. And as a result of that, they had outstanding reputation management. So on Etsy, they had over 5,000 reviews, all at 5 stars. I talked about that repeat purchase rate. They had over 7,000 Trustpilot reviews and Google reviews combined, and all of those at an average of 4.9. So people just loved the product that they were receiving, and as a result of that, it was a trusted brand, and buyers trusted what they were buying. However, as we pointed out before, lots of opportunity. So product line extensions. They didn't have nursery decor and accessories. They didn't have toddler clothing. That's ages 2 to 5. So it was all infant based. They didn't have gift sets and subscription boxes. They didn't have an eco-friendly line. So there was a lots of opportunity here. It was also direct to consumer Shopify. They hadn't sold on Amazon. They hadn't pursued any wholesale expansion to boutique retailers. They hadn't done any corporate gifting programs. There was a bunch of opportunity built into this business that buyers loved about it. Their SEO presence was actually really bad, and buyers saw that as an outstanding opportunity because this business just wasn't well optimized to win free customers off that traffic acquisition. And as a result of that, buyers were willing to come in fast. Now, where we got to was there are 5,000 signed, 5,000 NDAs signed. So the pulling power of one, the Flippa platform, bragging rights here, but also the quality of that business gave us the opportunity to drive some competitive tension, which is ultimately what you want in a business like that. Now, finally, Australian-based business bought by an American, which means couldn't use an SBA loan, had to be at least in this particular case, a cash buyer. So the deal ended up being all cash. And that's a really, really important point because sometimes sellers are actually willing to take a less high multiple, lesser valuation premium if there's all cash. And so you should know this as a seller, or if you're listening and you're a buyer, there's ways in which you've got some negotiation power and some bargaining power in thinking about what you're actually asking for. If it's an all cash deal, perhaps you're willing to take lesser from a profit multiple standpoint, but more upfront. Or maybe you want that multiple and it's therefore less upfront and more in the form of seller financing or stability payment. Long story short, it was, as I said, $7.5 million in revenue, $1.5 million or thereabouts in SDE, and sold for 2.7 times profit multiple. So hopefully that's a bit of insight for people. Let's have a look at some of these questions, Yali. Has anything struck you within this that we can start out with?
Yeah, to follow your lead because I'm having a hard time kind of getting the question more open here. So
No
free
problem at
to.
all. All right, let's just start with I guess a question around seven-figure exit value here. So generally speaking, when we talk about seven-figure exit value, we're actually talking about what we might call enterprise value in real world M&A land, and that's the same in this subscale land of sub $10 million turnover as well. So seven-figure exit value simply means that the business was acquired for greater than $1 million. And for those of understanding, trying to get a sense for how that plays out, you've got like 10% of Flippa's deals, which are seven figure. And that's the same as the landscape we were talking about in business formation land, actually, where the reality is there's far fewer seven-figure businesses than there are six-figure businesses, and there's far fewer eight-figure businesses than there are seven-figure businesses. That's just the law of large numbers playing out there. And that's how buyers will talk to you about your business, by the way. They'll talk to you about it in enterprise value. However, buyers will talk to you about it in enterprise value on either a revenue multiple or a profit multiple, depending on the shape of your business and how you think about it. There is a general question just here about how our two businesses work together. So just to be clear, you can work with Tailor Brands for anything you need to get up and going. So set up, grow a sustainable business, everything from compliant LLC formation, but all the way through to operating agreements, trademarks, websites, marketing assets, anything you need to get up and going. Tailor Brands is the best place to go for that. And Flippa is where you either buy or sell online businesses. Just to be clear, we do digital only. So you cannot sell a HVAC company with Flippa, for instance, unless you're selling maybe Amazon's parts, HVAC parts or something like that. There's a question from Naomi Payne here. I'm an LLC versus S-Corp. I'm currently running one as an S-Corp, but launching a second US-based business. So I'm looking to find out what is the best setup. Do you just want to give an overall statement around that, Yali?
Yeah, so I will say that, it's really hard to determine based on little data whether the right approach is an LLC, an S-Corp, a Corp in general, because an S-Corp is actually a tax deduction rather than the actual structure itself. You can actually run an LLC as an S-Corp. And what I would recommend there is go to tailorbrands.com. There's a series of questions that you can answer there and kind of get an answer for a lot of those specific questions.
Jen Fox asks a question about a smaller scale sale for an e-com brand, 100K sale price or less. All right, so you can expect Jen to achieve, it's a very big range, I must say. So do go to flippa.com/insights there. You'll see the multiples actually disclosed there in real time. Now, of course, there's top. So you can actually achieve 5 and 6 times profit multiples on a small scale brand, but you can equally achieve 1 to 3 times profit multiples. So that's a crazy range. And it really does come down to some of those things that Yali and I talked about today. How old is the business and is it predictable? Is the revenue consistent throughout the course of the year? Are you growing? Has year 3 been better than year 2? Has year 4 been better than year 3? Are the metrics good quality? So is your average order value greater than $70? The average for an e-commerce business is $70. Is your average order value greater than $70? Is your refund rate really, really low? In which case customers love what they're receiving. So there's so many variables here. To answer your question directly, the considerations are the same. Has it been formed well? Are your financials clean? Is the business's revenue predictable? Are there opportunities for long-term growth? Let's have a look so I should just point out, so Flippa is a platform and a brokerage. So there's a question about brokers and how you can get in touch. So Flippa has the largest business brokerage on the planet, online business brokers with M&A expertise across all the way from Austin to Amsterdam. But you can also self-service for smaller assets on the platform. A bigger business requires a more in-depth exit process. And as a result of that, we highly encourage people selling businesses in excess of 6 figures all the way up to 8 figures to do so with the help of a trusted M&A advisor. And you can find those on the Flippa platform. All right. Let's wrap it up, I think. So just in summary here, well, one, thank you, Yali. Awesome insights. You can reach Tailor Brands, obviously, at tailorbrands.com. A couple of key takeaways for everyone here. Yali talked about this: separate personal and business assets. Do that really, really early on. Focus on sustainable and repeatable growth. Reduce owner dependency. Think about the right setup from the beginning, and Tailor Brands is the best place to establish what the right setup is for you. And then build optionality. Even if you never sell, build optionality into the business by diversifying revenue and thinking about the metrics that matter and ensuring that those are tracked every single day with your SOPs. All right. A lot to take in here. Yali, any parting comments from you? I know you've got to go, and thank you so much for helping out today.
Yeah. So again, thank you so much for having us. And as mentioned here earlier, getting started the right way is super important for long-term success of your business. I would recommend everyone before they start to kind of go through that process, define their goal, work backwards from there, and of course, use Flippa when they're thinking about setting the business. Thank you everyone for tuning in, and thank you for having us here.
Thank you so much, everyone. Really appreciate you dialing in. Thanks for sticking with us through a slightly longer webinar than anticipated. But thank you again. Take care, everyone.